Okay, so we're starting part 3 of on the mode of existence of technical objects. So we finished part 2 last time. We had a little bit of a shorter session, but part 3 is exciting for me. This is my favorite part of the book. I think the first part is the one that gets the most attention in the secondary literature. The notion of the concretization of a technical object is something that's drawn a lot of attention. But this third part is a sort of anthropological part, a philosophical anthropology. So it looks at the relation where the technical reality fits in with the human relation to the world as a whole, and gives a sort of genesis of technical existence in the relation to the human relation to the world as a whole. So we have a little introduction, a few pages long, and then we have 2 chapters in this part, and then subsections in those chapters. So we'll see how far we get through today, I guess. Hopefully we can finish the introduction and get into the first chapter. Yeah, so I'll start with the beginning of the introduction, and then we can just go around with that. The existence of technical objects and the conditions of their genesis pose a question for philosophical thought which it cannot resolve through the simple consideration of technical objects themselves. What is the sense of the genesis of technical objects with respect to the whole of thought, of man's existence, and of his manner of being in the world? The fact that there is an organic aspect of thought and of the mode of being in the world obliges one to assume that the genesis of technical objects has repercussions on other human productions, on the attitude man has toward the world. But this is only a lateral and very imperfect way of posing the problem that the manifestation of technical objects leads us to confront, as a reality that is subject to genesis and whose genuine essence resides only in the lines of this genesis. Indeed, nothing proves that what we have here is an independent reality, which is to say that the technical object taken as a definite mode of existence. So here he's going beyond. So in the first 2 parts, he's been looking at the ontology of technical objects themselves, but now he's going to go beyond just looking at the technical object itself, but looking at it in relation to a human being. He wants to. So he poses the idea of an organic aspect of thought and of the mode of being in the world. This is something I think that we've seen a little bit of. I'm not sure if this connection is correct or not, but he's pointed to, for example, the role of the living being in setting up technical ensembles and the dependence of a technical ensemble on the living being. But he describes this as being an inadequate way of approaching technical reality as a whole. So he's going to, in the rest of this introduction, explain a little bit why that's inadequate.
Take over the next paragraph, if that's okay.
There was just one other thing I wanted to note, which is this term "being in the world," which is a classic Heideggerian phrase, and I'm not sure whether Simondon is drawing specifically on Heidegger here with that term, but it would be interesting to, I guess, compare to see what use Simondon makes of that term compared to Heidegger, and determine whether or not there's a sort of direct affiliation there.
Right. Yeah, I didn't even really notice that. It's so sneaky. Just puts in there. Of course, that Heidegger would insist on the finitude of determinate being, and he would call being in the world Dasein. Correct. I'm kind of rusty with my Heidegger.
Right, being in the world, if I remember correctly, is one of the existentials, one of the characteristics of Dasein, sort of the essential characteristics of Dasein. Yeah, I mean, again, I'm also a little bit rusty with Heidegger, but yeah, it would be interesting to make that comparison for someone who knows Heidegger a little bit better than I do.
Yeah, I did. I forgot who the author was, but I saw a work that was comparing Heidegger and Simondon as well, which I guess would make sense since Heidegger is famous for his philosophy of technology perspectives.
And also that Simondon was a student of Merleau-Ponty, right? And so Merleau-Ponty is kind of like pushing forward Heidegger's phenomenology into more of a like a fleshed phenomenology, or like a more sort of a field-like phenomenology, which winds up being very similar to what Simondon comes up with in terms of like a relationship of a living being in the world.
Right. Yeah. That's probably the sort of line through which, or lineage that through which he gets these Heideggerian terms. I would guess probably through Merleau-Ponty. Um, um, but this is sort of typical of Simondon, that he very rarely cites secondary sources. So we have to sort of guess what he's referring to sometimes, or if he's making a specific allusion to another author. Like it's never clearly cited, unfortunately. So it makes more work for us.
More fun for us.
More places to plow in our own opinions in the absence of historical evidence.
Yeah, I mean, it gives room for scholarship to trace some of these sources as well. But it would be nice to, it's not good citation practice, I would say, to just leave it to the reader to try to figure out what you're alluding to. Okay, I think we can go on to the next paragraph, 61, if you'd like to read.
Sure. If the mode of existence is definite because it derives from a genesis, then this genesis that engenders objects is perhaps not only the genesis of objects, or even the genesis of technical reality. Perhaps it originates even further back and constitutes a limited aspect of a larger process, and continues perhaps to engender other realities after having led to the appearance of technical objects. It is thus the genesis of all of technicity that needs to be understood, that of objects and that of non objectified realities, and the entire genesis implicating man and the world, of which the genesis of technicity is perhaps only a small part, shouldered and balanced by other geneses that are prior, posterior, or complementary, and correlative with that of technical objects.
Right. So this is drawing on he's going to make a reference in the next paragraph, I think, or fairly soon, drawing on his other work, the information in the light of, individuation in the light of the notions of form and information. So we read the introduction to that work a few months ago when we started this group. But the key idea here is the idea of a genesis as a process of becoming that produces an object or an individual, as well as a non-individuated surrounding or milieu. So the hypothesis that he's presenting here, which he's going to, I guess, defend over the course of this part of the book, is the hypothesis that technical reality is the result of such a genesis. So there's a process of genesis that produces technical reality, but also something alongside of technical reality that plays the role of a milieu or a non-individuated surrounding outside of technical reality. So that's sort of the big picture of what he's going to do, and he's going to fill in the details a little bit more throughout this introduction.
A phrase comes to my mind from the other book. I'm not sure if I remember correctly, but he uses this, what I take to be a catchword for him, a monism of Genesis. It's not a dualism, but a monism of Genesis, particularly. So earlier he mentioned modes of existence, among them technical objects being one of them, or technicity being one of them. It makes sense that everything is to be considered in its genesis, and it is only on this level that we can talk about a monism.
Right. I don't remember that exact phrase from the other book, but it does, I think, correctly characterize his approach here. So when he wants to do, so I think when he does ontology, what he takes the ontology to mean is giving a genesis of an object or a certain mode of existence. So yeah, ontology and genesis are sort of coordinate concepts for him. So to present, to do ontology is to present the essence of something as a genesis. So technical reality, you specify the ontology of technical reality by indicating the genesis of technical reality.
Yeah, I think he's about to go into that aforementioned book in the next couple paragraphs. If we want to continue.
Yeah, so I think we can read probably the next two short paragraphs together, if someone would like to pick that up.
I could go if you like.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay. We therefore need to move toward a generalized genetic interpretation of the relation between man and the world in order to grasp the philosophical importance of the existence of technical objects. The very notion of genesis, however, deserves to be made more precise. The word genesis is taken here in the sense defined in the study on individuation in the light of the notions of form and of information, as the process of individuation in its generality. There is genesis when the coming into being of a system of a primitively oversaturated reality, rich in potential, greater than unity, and harboring an internal incompatibility, constitutes for this system the discovery of compatibility, a resolution through the advent of structure. This structuration is the advent of an organization that is the basis of an equilibrium of metastability. Such genesis opposes itself to the degradation of the potential energies contained in a system through the passage to a stable state from which transformation is no longer possible.
Right, so this is like a super condensed summary of his other book, basically in one paragraph, which probably a little bit dense for those who haven't read the other book, but we did read the introduction, so we have at least some familiarity with some of these concepts, and a lot of them sort of come back in other works that he's written as well that we've come across. But it's also noteworthy that the individuation book was not published at the time he was writing this. So the two books were his two theses for the doctoral thesis. You had to do a major thesis and a minor thesis, and so the individuation book was the major thesis, and the technical objects book was the minor thesis. But he's basically referring to his own work as if the reader would have read it, even though it hadn't been published yet at the time, which is kind of strange. And actually, the full book, so the individuation book was published. The first half of it or so was published in 1962, I think, in the 60s anyway, a few years after this book comes out. But the second part, or the second half, was not published until 1989, and then the whole thing together was, I think, was published in 2004 or something like that. So long after his death. So he's referring to a book that would not actually be completely published as a whole until after his death, which is again a little bit of a strange approach to just sort of assume that the reader would know this.
Are those the original publication dates or the translation, the translations?
Yeah, those are the original publication dates in French.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, there were, I think there were some issues with, well, I think it maybe shows that he was a little more optimistic about publication, that he assumed that he would be able to publish his thesis without too much trouble. But he, I guess, had faced more difficulty with publication than he anticipated. But to get to the that sort of conceptual development that he's sketching in this paragraph. So the general idea is of individuation that starts from a system that is supersaturated, and he described it as greater than identity. So it doesn't have, or greater than unity, sorry. It doesn't follow the principle of non-contradiction. It's or the principle of the excluded middle. So it's a supersaturated state, and then that system individuates. So part of it becomes an individual, and part of it becomes the surrounding milieu. And he's distinguishing this from the process of degradation of potential energies. So when a system undergoes a degradation process, it loses that potential energy and turns to a stable state from which work can't be extracted. So that's he wants to make that distinction very clear. So the individuation always results in a metastable state that still retains potential.
Yeah, that it is kind of dense. I mostly can make sense of it, but I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it, having not read really much or any rather of the individuation text. So this is probably a helpful bit for me then, because yeah, I was kind of in the dark about these ideas until this paragraph. So
all right, and Berkay has posted in the chat here the link to the text about the monism, or the genetic monism. Yeah, so that's helpful. I'll have to take a look at that paragraph after we're done today to refresh my memory of that.
just to as a short clarification question, the kind of oversaturation of reality that he points out in this paragraph, you made the remark that it was related to a kind of logical overdetermination. Is it where logical rules of classical logic would not be in comportment with it? Is this correct in the interpretation?
Yeah, that's right. He characterizes this pre-individual state as not following the rule of the excluded middle, and I think non-contradiction as well. I'd have to check that again, but the idea is that a sort of logically classical set of states would be the result of the individuation process, rather than sort of being presupposed by the process of individuation. So what exists before that individuation therefore doesn't follow the classical rules of logic.
Oh, okay. So I'm gonna have to put in a notch of like logical pluralism as far as Simondon goes as well. Then, among the many other characteristics he seems to have.
Yeah, it's not something that he develops a lot in the other book. He sort of makes the note in passing, or not quite in passing, I guess, but it's not one of the sort of central concepts of his book. But he does characterize classical logic as being a sort of subdomain ontologically, or corresponding to an ontological subdomain of the individuated, whereas being as a whole includes individuated and non-individuated realities. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next paragraph. So I'll read it. It's a little bit long. The general hypothesis we are making about the sense of the coming into being of man's relation with the world consists in considering the whole, l'ensemble, formed by man and the world as a system. This hypothesis, however, is not limited to the affirmation that man and the world form a vital system, comprising the living thing and its milieu. Evolution could indeed be considered an adaptation, i.e. a quest for a stable equilibrium of the system through a reduction of the gap between the living thing and the milieu. The notion of adaptation, however, together with the notion of function and the functional finality to which it is linked, would lead us to see the coming into being of the relation between man and the world as tending toward a state of stable equilibrium, which does not appear to be correct in man's case, perhaps no more than it is for any living being. If one wanted to preserve a vitalist foundation for this hypothesis of genetic coming into being, then one could call upon the notion of élan vital presented by Bergson. And indeed, this notion is excellent for demonstrating what is lacking in the notion of adaptation in order for it to enable an interpretation of the coming into being of life, devenir vital, but it is not compatible with it, and an antagonism without possible mediation subsists between adaptation and the élan vital. It seems that these two opposed notions, as the couple they form, can be replaced by the notion of the individuation of oversaturated systems, conceived as successive resolutions of tensions through the discovery of structures at the heart of a system rich in potential. Tensions and tendencies can be conceived as really existing in a system. The potential is one of the forms of the real, as completely as the actual. The potentials of a system constitute its power of coming into being without degradation. They are not the simple virtuality of future states, but a reality that pushes them into being. Coming into being is not the actualization of a virtuality or the result of a conflict between actual realities, but the operation of a system with potentials in its reality. Coming into being is a series of spurts of structurations of a system, or of successive individuations of a system. So he's here further developing the concept of genesis, and he's I guess contrasting it with two possible notions of vital individuation or vital development, le devenir vital. Or you could say vital becoming, I guess would be a more literal translation. So one would be adaptation in the evolutionary sense. And this is a sort of a general problem in evolutionary biology about what adaptation means exactly. But a sort of traditional concept of adaptation would be that the environment is fixed, and then the organism or the population of organisms over time changes in such a way that the organism becomes adapted to that environment. So the fitness of the population increases over time. And then so that's one concept of this vital becoming, or the becoming of the living entity. And then the other one that he points to is the concept of élan vital from Bergson, which is explicitly presented as in opposition to adaptation. So it's the idea of a certain finality in evolution, but it's a finality that it's not driven to the one sort of goal. It's not the idea that evolution has an end state, but it's the idea that there's a sort of onward push of evolution, which can be realized through different lineages. So you can have insects and human beings are both results of this sort of onward push of evolution, but in different lineages. Yeah, so it's a little bit of a mysterious concept in the sense that it's defined sort of negatively as being not adaptation, but the general idea is that life as such sort of pushes itself into evolution, in development into different forms and different lineages. And then so Simondon, he presents these two notions as being this sort of complementary pair that contrast with each other. So each one is sort of defined by excluding the other one. And then he presents his own notion of becoming as being sort of overcoming this opposition, not by conciliating them, but by being beyond that opposition, as a more abstract notion of development that is not specifically reduced to the development of organic beings.
Yeah, I think interestingly, interesting for me at least was that in reading the last few sessions, it almost gave me the impression that he was advocating for some kind of vitalism because of the the constitution of the milieu of technical object by the life form necessarily. But here he seems to be distancing himself not only from the cybernetic definitions, but also the vitalist tradition as well, with a kind of critique of Bergson, or a distancing from this kind of like univocal. Um, I don't know exactly how it's almost a Mysterian aspect, as you said. I'm not extremely studied in vitalism either, or Bergson necessarily, but there does seem to be a distancing from Bergson, who is very, very influential and popular in Europe and France specifically in the early 20th century.
Right. Yeah. It's kind of easy to forget just how big Bergson was. Like he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in the 20s, I think, or the 30s. I can't remember exactly when. So he was, well known enough, not just in philosophical circles, but outside of, in broader sort of literary culture, that he was given a Nobel Prize. But then in the sort of, I guess, in the second half of the 20th century, roughly, he sort of fell out of favor to a large extent, until he was sort of revived by Deleuze, and I think probably around the year 2000 or so, it started coming back into fashion. But yeah, so Simondon here is definitely defining himself in opposition to Bergson and to vitalism as a whole. But he doesn't just say vitalism is wrong. He wants to account for the reality that vitalism is depicting. So he wants to give a concept of Genesis that is broader than just the development of organic beings through the élan vital. He wants to give a more abstract account of Genesis that can account for the development that the vitalists are pointing to. And another point in this paragraph is a pretty dense paragraph. There's lots in here, but right towards the end, where he contrasts the idea of potentials with virtuality. So here he's drawing on again on Bergson, and Bergson had criticized the notion of a pure possibility. So something that would be basically just a copy of the actual, or like a shadow version of the actual world, that would then sort of receive existence in some sort of obscure way. And this is drawing on the problem that Kant introduced as well, like the question of the difference between 100 possible dollars and 100 actual dollars. The concept, there's no difference in concept between possible dollars and actual dollars, but that leaves the actual difference between possibility and actuality mysterious. And Kant tries to use the idea of sensation to fill that gap. But Bergson argues instead that we have to understand, rather than having these sort of shadow possibilities that somehow receive existence, we have to understand potentiality as something that is just as real as the actual. So the world is composed not just of actual entities, but also of potentials that are just as real as those actual entities, and they bring about changes through their own working, and it's not rather than being sort of empty shadows that receive existence from outside in some mysterious way. That's what he's drawing on here in this last bit of the paragraph. So he's aligning himself, Simondon here is aligning himself with Bergson in that respect, in rejecting the idea of possibilities as sort of shadow copies of the world.
Right. Yeah. And there's of course, a classic philosophical distinction from de interpretatione. I'm bad at pronouncing things, but the Aristotle text in which almost all the talk of actual possibilities kind of arises from. And it seems like most conversations related to possibilia and actual possibilities tend to have their kind of more historical bearing, at least classically, in the kind of Aristotelian scholarship tradition.
Right, that's a text that I don't remember too much about, except for the whole possible battle or
The sea battle.
the sea battle. Yeah. Yeah, so it's a question of if the proposition there will be a sea battle tomorrow is true, then it would. Sorry, if it's true, that means it's true now. And then the question is, how is it still sort of open? How is the possibility of that battle open? Or because the battle could happen and it could also not happen unless you hold to a determinist position, which Aristotle doesn't want to hold. So he needs to find a way to account for contingency in the world, despite the logical specification of future contingents as either true or false.
Yeah, that was a very, very good explanation, actually.
I mean, again, that's my sort of distant memory of having read that years ago. So I'm sure there's a much more detail that you could go into for someone who knew that better. But yeah, so that's sort of the antecedent, I guess, of the same problem that Kant is pointing to, the relation between the possible and the actual, and it seems it's hard to give a good explanation of what that difference consists in, especially when you like Kant does, if you deny that there's any conceptual difference between the possible and the actual. So the concept of 100 possible dollars and the concept of 100 actual dollars is the same. Then it makes it very difficult to explain what that difference consists in. Yeah, and so the sort of Bergsonian lineage or tradition wants to reject that as a false problem and look instead at the actualization of potentials rather than the realization of possibilities as being the type of problem that is solvable.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's something we can sort of keep in mind as we're reading the rest of this introduction. That's sort of in the background, this notion of potentials as part of the real world, just as much as actual entities are. That's sort of always in the background with Simondon.
It's interesting. It's odd to me because it's the way that I'm reading it. I don't know Bergson well, but I've read Deleuze to some degree, and this idea of coming into being is not the actualization of a virtuality. Would seem to like sort of everything you've been saying for the past few minutes seems very compatible with the way that Deleuze is talking, and yet this sentence coming into being is not the actualization of a virtuality feels like it runs against the grain of that, because for Deleuze, those virtualities are the potentials contained with things that will become actualized or whatever in the ways that you've been talking about.
Right. I think here it's just a question of terminology. I think Deleuze uses the term virtual to describe, like you said, those potentialities that become actualized, whereas here Simondon was using the term virtuality to refer to the sort of shadow concept of a possibility as a copy of the actual world. So yeah, it's just the terminological difference. I think the actual at the conceptual level, I think this is definitely something that Deleuze draws from Bergson and sort of sees confirmed in Simondon.
Okay.
Or we could be less charitable and say maybe he wants to show or signal how more rational than Bergson he is, and how less prone to spirituality and spiritualism, as they call it.
Yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. I would have to go back to Bergson and see which terms he uses specifically in this context, because I don't like. I know he definitely sort of rejects the term possibility as part of that false problem of the 100 possible dollars. But I'm not sure how he uses the term virtuality, whether he uses it in the sense closer to the way Deleuze uses it, to represent those real potentialities in the world, or whether he uses virtuality closer to the way that Simondon uses it, as virtuality being synonymous with possibilities. Yeah, so I would have to go back and check that, but it would be an interesting question to look into. And yeah, that's the other aspect of your comment there that's interesting is the notion of spiritualism, which Bergson is characterized as a vitalist, but also as a spiritualist, because he wants to preserve some notion of a body-spirit dualism. It's quite a different notion than, say, in Descartes or the sort of classical mind-body dualism, but he still wants to preserve some notion of a spirit as something distinct from the body, and he sort of defends that as an important philosophical position. So that's why he's characterized as a spiritualist, and I think Simondon would not want to be characterized as a spiritualist in the same way.
Yeah, isn't the vitalism is dependent on a kind of spiritualism, right? That the vital spirit, sort of.
Right. Yeah. So the élan vital, this sort of force that pushes evolution forward, is related to the spiritual principle, or spirit as something distinct from matter. So yeah, there's definitely a relationship between the vitalism and the spiritualism, and I think it's a sort of open problem, or an interesting problem to see if that's sort of a necessary connection. Like, is it does vitalism sort of necessarily entail spiritualism? Because this is something that I mean, it's a little bit off topic, but I think it's interesting to pursue that. Deleuze is sometimes characterized as being a spiritualist philosopher in certain ways, precisely because of his vitalism. It's a sort of a more abstract spiritualism compared to Bergson, but I think there's a certain truth to that characterization. And so it'd be interesting with Simondon to investigate to what extent his sort of quasi-vitalism, or his appreciation for vitalism, to what extent it forces him into some sort of spiritualism, or whether he's capable of sort of grasping the positive aspect of vitalism without becoming a spiritualist. So that's something, I'm not sure. I don't have an answer to that question, but I think it's something that would be worth keeping in mind as well while we're reading this.
Okay, should I read the next section?
Yes, go ahead.
The relation of man to the world is not a simple adaptation, governed by a law of self-regulating finality that would find ever increasingly stable states of equilibrium. On the contrary, the evolution of this relation, in which technicity participates among other modes of being, manifests an ability to evolve that grows at each stage, discovering new forms and forces capable of making it evolve even more, rather than stabilizing it and making it tend towards more and more limited fluctuations. The very notion of finality, applied to this coming into being, appears inadequate, since one can indeed find limited finalities within this coming into being, search for food, defense against destructive forces, but there is no unique and superior end that one could superimpose on all aspects of evolution in order to coordinate them and account for their orientation through the search for an end that would be superior to all particular ends. This is why it is not forbidden to call upon a hypothesis that intervenes with a more primitive genetic schema than that of the opposed aspects of adaptation in élan vital, and enclosing both of them as abstract limit cases, namely that of the successive stages of an individuating structuration, going from metastable state to metastable state by means of successive inventions of structures.
Right, so this is another example of this typical form of argument that we've seen on a number of occasions before, where he sets up this opposition of two positions regarding a subject matter, here development or genesis. So he sets up these two positions, and then he wants to articulate a third position that is more fundamental than the two, and from which those two can be derived as limit cases. And so he's not, it's not a sort of compromise position. It's not like a little of both or something like that. It's something that underlies the two opposed positions and then generates those two opposed positions as limit cases. I mean, it's also interesting to look at that notion of finality that he's opposing here, which I think we can connect with his criticism of cybernetics as being too closely limited to the machine animal analogy or the machine living being analogy. So because cybernetics is sort of treats this analogy as a real relationship or a real identity of structure between the machine and the organism, it treats the stability of states or the homeostasis as being what is essential to a living being. But of course, living beings don't simply, there's no sort of total end that living beings tend towards. There's a variety of different ends. And homeostasis is only a part of the structure of a living being. And there's also lots of other processes that have their own ends, whether it's reproduction or searching for food or defense or whatever other ends you can point to for living beings. And there's no sort of total end that a living being is directed towards. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph then, which I can read. The technicity that manifests itself in the use of objects can perhaps be conceived as appearing in a structuration that provisionally resolves the problems posed by the primitive and original phase of man's relationship to the world. One can call this first phase the magical phase, taking this word in its most general sense and considering the magical mode of existence as the pre-technical and pre-religious mode, and so as immediately above the relationship that is simply between the living thing and its milieu. The magical mode of the relation with the world is not devoid of all organization. On the contrary, it is rich in implicit organization, attached to the world and to man. In the magical mode, the relation between man and the world is not yet concretized and constituted as standing apart by means of specialized objects or human beings. But this mediation does exist functionally in the most elementary of all structurations, which is also the first, that from which erupts the distinction between figure and ground in the universe. Technicity appears as a structure that resolves an incompatibility. It specializes the figural functions, while religions on their side specialize the functions of ground. The original magical universe, which is rich in potentials, structures itself by splitting in two. Technicity appears as one of the two aspects of a solution given to the problem of man's relation with the world, the other simultaneous and correlated aspect being the institution of definite religions. However, coming into being does not stop at the discovery of technicity. From being a solution, technicity once more becomes a problem when it reconstitutes a system via an evolution that leads from technical objects to technical ensembles. The technical universe is saturated, then oversaturated in turn, at the same time as the religious universe, just as it had happened with the magical universe. The inherence of technicity to technical objects is provisional. It constitutes only a moment of genetic coming into being. So again, there's quite a bit in this paragraph. So he's given so in what we've read up to this paragraph, he's given a sort of a short summary of his concept of genesis and genetic development, and then now he's going to give the application of that concept to the genesis of technical reality. And 61 has found a good graph of this sort of process of genesis. And so we start with magic as the primitive relation or original relation of the human being to the world. And then each stage of the genesis occurs by a splitting between figure and ground aspects. again, this is drawing on Gestalt psychology. So the figure is the shape or the structure of perception, the individuated object, and then the ground is the background on which that figure appears. And so magic separates into figure and ground, which are represented as technics and religion. So technics is the figure aspect and religion is the ground aspect. And then as we proceed through this development, each of those will in turn split into figure and ground as well.
I'll go ahead and post this image as the thumbnail for the video when I post it up on YouTube this time as well.
Yeah, that seems like a good image to use for this whole third part.
I'm having a little bit of trouble understanding what this last sentence means. The inherence of technicity to technical objects is provisional. It constitutes only a moment of genetic coming into being. How would you sort of read that meaning-wise?
I think what it means here, yeah, I agree that it is a little bit obscure. I think it's pointing to the fact that technical or technical reality or technicity is only one stage of the process. It's a provisional solution to a problem, and then it itself becomes a problem later on, which requires solution. So that's the sense in which it's provisional. It's one moment of the genetic process of coming into being.
I had a similar difficulty, but there are some further passages in the further pages, like 176. He makes a similar statement there about the inexhaustibility of technicity to technical objects. So he says, for instance, we are going to get there, but this is just by way of anticipation. Insufficient to start from constituted technical objects. Objects appear at a certain moment, but technicity precedes them and goes beyond them. Again, he's repeating himself, I guess. The technical objects result from an objectification of technicity. They are produced by it. Yeah, so technicity is not exhausted in the object. So a passage to the same effect, I guess. But yeah, still very puzzling. How are we to consider this technicity that is not in the object? Is it an essence? Is it like a natura naturans to the natura naturata of technical objects as already constituted? I guess here the key is constituted versus constitution or constitutiveness.
Yeah, and maybe I guess conceptually it's kind of an artifact of the whole need to commit himself to a kind of structuring operations and operational structures sort of way of approaching things.
Yeah, I think you're right to compare this to the natura naturata, natura naturans distinction. So technical reality would be this naturans type of existence or constituting existence, and then the technical object would be the constituted or the naturata form of existence. So there's always this sort of underlying structuring process that produces a structure, but is not reducible to that structure. It contains more reality than the structure that results from the process.
Am I correct in remembering that that is Spinozan nomenclature?
Yeah, that's Spinoza's term, natura naturata, natura naturans. So they're both aspects of God, Deus sive natura, God or nature, which are synonymous terms for Spinoza. But there's nature insofar as it is producing producing entities, I guess you could say, and then there's nature insofar as it is produced entities.
I should probably commit that distinction to memory.
Yeah, Spinoza is cool. We can do a Spinoza reading group maybe at some point after we're done reading whatever Simondon is available to us.
Sure, I would be on board with that as well.
So I would like to join that too.
Cool. We'll put that in our reserve for after we're done with the texts that are available to us from Simondon. I was just going to say that we can also remember that what we're reading so far is just the introduction to this whole part of the book. So a lot of the things that are presented in a sort of elliptical fashion here, or in a very compressed way, will be developed in more detail in the chapters themselves. So if there's things that are a little bit obscure as we're reading it now, then it's not necessary. It's likely that it will be explained further in the rest of the part. Okay, so I think we can go on to the next two short paragraphs, or maybe three, because they look like they're all tied together, the next three paragraphs.
I can go. Now, according to this hypothesis, technicity must never be considered an isolated reality, but as part of a system. It is a partial reality and a transitory reality, both the result and principle of Genesis. Being the result of an evolution, technicity is also the depositary of a capacity to evolve, precisely because, as solution to a first problem, it has the capacity to be a mediation between man and the world. This hypothesis would entail two consequences. First, the technicity of objects or of thought cannot be considered as a complete reality or as a mode of thinking having its own independent truth. Any form of thought or any mode of existence engendered by technicity would need to be complemented and balanced out by another mode of thought or existence coming from the religious world. Secondly, as the emergence of technicity marks a break within and a splitting into of the primitive magical unity, technicity, like religiosity, is heir to a capacity for evolutionary divergence. In the coming into being of man's mode of being in the world, this force of divergence must be compensated by a force of convergence, by a relational function maintaining unity despite this divergence. The splitting of the magical structure wouldn't be viable unless a function of convergence stood in opposition to the powers of divergence.
Right. So again, there's stuff to unpack here because it's a little bit dense. But so he's presenting. So the hypothesis is that that technical reality is the result of a genesis from the splitting of magical reality, and then is itself subject to splitting further on. So that's the hypothesis. And then he draws two consequences from that hypothesis. So first is that technical thinking doesn't have truth in itself or as a separate mode of thinking. It's only in coordination with religious thinking or religious existence that technical thinking has its sort of concrete truth. So they're sort of coordinate modes of existence, the technical and the religious. And then the second consequence that he draws from that hypothesis is that there's this sort of contrary tendency. So in the same way or in conjunction with the splitting tendency that leads magic to split into technics and religion, and then leads each of those to split further on. There's also a tendency towards coordination of what has been split. So if we look at that diagram, you can see that there are a series of concepts down the middle of the split, and as we go through the chapter, we'll see how those concepts fit in. But each of them is a sort of coordination of those split realities. So insofar as human being in the world is a unity, then the split between different modes of existence has to also have a sort of convergence of those modes of existence. They have to be unified in some way, and that's what those other concepts are going to do. So that's the second consequence of the hypothesis. Okay, so we can go on to the next couple short paragraphs here, which I'll read. These two reasons make it necessary to study where technicity comes from, what it results in, and what relations it maintains with man's other modes of being, which is to say, how it opens itself to functions of convergence. Now, the general sense of coming into being would be the following. Different forms of thinking and of being in the world diverge as soon as they appear, i.e. when they are not saturated. Then they reconverge when they are saturated and tend to structure themselves through new splits. The functions of convergence can take place by virtue of the oversaturation of the evolutionary forms of being in the world, at the spontaneous level of aesthetic thought and at the reflected level of philosophical thought. Technicity becomes oversaturated by once again incorporating the reality of the worlds to which it is applied. Religiosity, on the other hand, becomes oversaturated by incorporating the reality of human groups whose primitive relation with the world it mediates. Thus oversaturated, technicity splits into theory and praxis, in the same way that religiosity splits into ethics and dogma.
That's very clarifying, actually, the characterization of the split between theory and praxis.
Yeah, this is, again, it's going to be developed in more detail as we go along, but the technical reality is the result of that split. And then, as we'll see later, scientific thought is a process of convergence between theological dogma or religious dogma and the theory that comes from technical reality. So we'll see that in more detail later on.
I'm starting to somewhat understand the diagram I posted now.
Yeah, the diagram, of course, is a very schematic version of what the whole part of the book is going to present. So it takes reading through it to actually be able to understand properly how the diagram works. And maybe another points we can point out in this these last couple paragraphs is this notion of saturation, which so we saw that Genesis occurs through the supersaturated reality becoming split into the individual and then the surrounding milieu. So in this sort of continuous process, or not continuous, but extended process of Genesis that he's pointing to here, you have each stage splits once it becomes saturated. So magic becomes saturated and then splits into technical reality and religion. And then eventually technical reality and religion themselves become saturated and they split in turn. That concept of saturation is something that's going to be important throughout the rest of the part of this book.
All right, should I read this next sizable paragraph here?
Sure, go ahead.
Thus, there would not only be a genesis of technicity, but also a genesis on the basis of technicity, through the splitting of an original technicity into figure and ground, fond, the ground corresponding to the functions of totality that are independent of each application of technical gestures, whereas the figure, made of definite and particular schemas, specifies each technique as a matter of acting. The deepest reality, réalité de fond of techniques, constitutes theoretical knowledge, whereas the particular schemas give us praxis. It is the figural realities of religions which, on the contrary, constitute themselves as a coherent dogma, while the grounding reality, réalité de fond, becomes ethical and detached from dogma. There is an analogy to be found between the praxis that issues forth from techniques and the ethics issuing forth from religions, as well as an analogy between the theoretical knowledge of the sciences, which issues forth from techniques, and religious dogma. This analogy comes both from the identity of the representative aspect of both scientific knowledge and religious dogma, or the active aspect of the praxis of both techniques and ethics, and also from the incompatibility that arises from the fact that these different modes of thinking issue forth either from figural realities or from grounding realities. The purpose, sense, of philosophical thought, intervening between the two representative orders and the two active orders of thought, is to make them converge and establish a mediation between them. Now, in order for this mediation to be possible, the very genesis of these forms of thought must be known and accomplished in a complete manner on the basis of previous stages of technicity and religiosity. Therefore, philosophical thought must start from the genesis of technicity, integrated into the ensemble of genetic processes that precede it, follow, and surround it, not only in order to be able to know technicity in itself, but in order to grasp the problems that dominate the philosophical problematic at their very basis. The theory of knowledge and the theory of action, in the relation with the theory of being.
Right. So again, he's sort of quickly running through the stages of this process of genesis that are outlined in the diagram. So we'll see that in further detail later on. We don't need to worry too much about all those details of the process at this point. There is one point, just a point of translation here that I think is, I mean, I don't like the way they did it. I'm not sure if there's a better way to do it, but so the term ground, like figure and ground, the term ground there is translating fond, which means like the background of a picture, but it also means like the bottom of something, like le fond de l'océan, like the bottom of the ocean. And so that, or the depths of the ocean, something like that. And so I think they're trying to sort of use both or draw on both meanings here. So they take the term réalité de fond, they translate that as the deepest reality in one sentence, and then in the next sentence they translate it as grounding reality. So I think it would be better just to stick with one translation of that term, like reality of ground or something like that. Just with keeping in mind that the French term also has this connotation of the depths or the bottom of something.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I wonder why they chose to translate one word in two different ways. I'm always curious about this when I run into it in English translations. It almost seems devious in some ways, or perhaps they had two options available and decided they would just go with both.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to be too critical. I mean, like I've said before, I think this is a very good translation as a whole, but there's always, little points where you can disagree with their choices. But I think what they were trying to do is get across both of those aspects of the term fond, the idea of a background of a picture, then also the depths of the ocean or something like that. Because I think both of those aspects are at work in Simondon's use of the term, but I think it would have been better for them to stick with one term because like Simondon was using it as a technical term here. And so I think it's best to just stick with one term to translate the term that he's using. And then you can make it like maybe a footnote to explain some of the nuances of the term.
Yeah, that would definitely aid in interpretation if they were to translate in a slightly more linear fashion. But I do find it interesting, though, that there is that similarity between the background in terms of like a painting and like the bottom. The bottom and the background are semantically situated very close to one another in the language of the author. I find that very fascinating.
Yeah, and I think the sort of conceptual connection you can make is the idea is you're looking downwards towards the bottom of the ocean, then something near the surface, fish or whatever near the surface will appear as the sort of figure, the foreground, and then the bottom of the ocean would be the background. And then, so when Simondon is using this term ground or fond, there's always, so even if it has that sense of the pictorial background, there's always still the sense of something like a depth from which something can come up. It's not just like a static sort of blank canvas or something like that. It's something that contains potentials that can be realized in future in the figural.
I mean, that to me, that kind of hangs together with the way that Heidegger's work is sometimes just going back to the idea of being in the world, the way that the way that he talks about the clearing or the opening, like sort of the event that causes the opening, and which people tend to sort of run together as the groundless ground, right? So that there's a sense in which, I mean, that it's embodied in the sense of being a figure ground gestalt, but that you can also bring that language down into the ontological level. I think that that's kind of maybe an important sort of note being sounded here too. I don't know, like Deleuze wrote a book called What is Grounding, where he sort of goes back and looks at various philosophical figures and sort of their understanding of the kind of the axiomatics that they staged at the start of their arguments in order to establish a ground.
Yeah, and grounding is even popular in analytic circles these days.
Yeah, there's a whole literature in analytic metaphysics and ontology on grounding, and what relations it has to logical inference and causation and other types of relationships. So that's another aspect. So fond is related etymologically to the term fondement, foundation, which has the sort of literal meaning of the foundations of a house, but also foundations in an epistemological sense. So the foundations of a philosophical system or of an intellectual position or whatever conceptual or cognitive term you want to use. So yeah, fonder, like to found something, to set it up on a firm basis. So basis would be another term you could use to translate fond as well. So it's a term that has sort of a variety of related meanings, which makes it hard to translate.
Well, I suppose we should get into chapter 1 if y'all are ready and equipped.
Yeah, I think we have half an hour, 40 minutes or so on the recording, so we can start into chapter 1. So I can start reading. So it's chapter 1, the genesis of technicity. Section 1, the notion of the phase applied to coming into being, technicity as a phase. This study postulates that technicity is one of the two fundamental phases of the mode of existence of the whole constituted by man and the world. By phase we mean not a temporal moment replaced by another, but an aspect that results from a splitting in two of being, and in opposition to another aspect. This sense of the word phase is inspired by the notion of the phase ratio in physics. One cannot conceive of a phase except in relation to another or to several other phases. In a system of phases, there is a relation of equilibrium and of reciprocal tensions. It is the actual system of all phases taken together that is the complete reality, not each phase in itself. A phase is only a phase in relation to others, from which it distinguishes itself in a manner that is totally independent of the notions of genus and species. The existence of a plurality of phases finally defines the reality of a neutral center of equilibrium in relation to which there is a phase shift. This schema is very different from the dialectical schema, because it implies neither necessary succession nor the intervention of the negativity as a motor of progress. Furthermore, opposition within the schema of phases only exists in the particular case of a two-phase structure. The adoption of, I'll continue here. The adoption of such a schema founded upon the notion of the phase aims to put into play a principle according to which the temporal development of a living reality proceeds through a split on the basis of an initial active center, then through a regrouping after the furtherance of each separated reality resulting from this split. Each separated reality is the symbol of the other, just as each phase is the symbol of the other phase or phases. No phase, as a phase, is balanced with respect to itself, nor does it contain a complete truth or reality. Every phase is abstract and partial, untenable. Only the system of phases is in equilibrium in its neutral point. Its truth and reality are this neutral point, the procession and conversion in relation to this neutral point.
I find these two paragraphs interesting here to start off the chapter with, in the way they contrast Simondon's method with the dialectical method, which my bearing is related to Hegel's dialectical approach. What Simondon is terming phase seems to replace what Hegel would term the dialectical moment, which are linear and ordered in a sense that they're successive. And this it seems to be the departure between the two, that being that the criteria of succession that's related to the progression of the dialectical moments into their convergent totality in Hegel's approach is not considered to be central, and the notion of phase rather than moment almost points to a kind of ergodicity or a repeatability of this type of um, I don't know whether to call it a system or a system of explication, I suppose, such that there seems to be well, in the sense of frequencies, if you take a wavelength and look at the different or two wavelengths that are slightly, very, very slightly different in frequency from one another, there can be a kind of a gradual phase shifting that goes on in which there is a repetition that is implicit in the kind of parameters of the frequency. Whereas with Hegel's dialectical moments, there's never considered to be a kind of returning to an original state or a point in which the phases would substantially overlap in what I would call an ergodic manner.
Yeah, that's interesting. An interesting comparison or illustration of what he's talking about. So in the dialectical schema or dialectical mode of thinking, there's always progression from one stage to the next one, and each stage preserves something from the previous one. Hegel always describes something as the truth of the previous stage. So it overcomes the limitation of one stage, and then it preserves the positive aspect of that stage. And so Simondon wants to distinguish his mode of thinking or his presentation of this genetic process from the dialectical process, precisely in that it doesn't have this same notion of a necessary succession or this linear progress through this sequence of stages. So each stage is sort of the development that it undergoes is not the result of some sort of linear process that preserves reality like a dialectical process. And then the other opposition that he presents with the dialectical process is that there's no negation in his schema of Genesis. So the dialectical process always involves a positive reality and then a negation, and then the overcoming of the negation at a higher level that retains the positive aspect. But in Simondon's schema, there's no negation as the motor of progress. There's no opposition except insofar as there are two stages. Two phases. Once only in a process that is limited to two phases is there an opposition, but there's no necessity that there's only going to be two phases. It could be 3, 10, whatever phases.
Yeah, I read that in relation to negation. I read this as posteriorizing the negation criteria, such that any negation would be the result of these phase shifts rather than implicit in a kind of a priori sense, in the way that the dialectic method, such that Hegel would be famous for, would posit as having this, I don't want to say essential because it's probably not the right word to use, but probably necessary. Necessary is a better word to use here. The essential, of course, is very hard to unpack for Hegel specifically, but the way that negation is opposed in Hegel's science of logic to reality. So reality and negation are considered to be in a kind of innate dialectical opposition in the doctrine of being.
Yeah, and like throughout, like there's the specific category of negation within the science of logic, but there's also throughout the whole logical process, there's determinate negation is sort of the motor of the whole process that that makes one stage move on to the next one. Whereas for Simondon, there's no role for negation at that level. And I think you're right that he would say that negation is a secondary reality, or something that's produced as a result of this process of genesis. So in the same way that the classical logical principles are results, I think he would put negation in that same category.
I just want to say I find it very interesting that perhaps from the start of today's talk, this link between logic and metaphysics has been coming up a lot, I noticed.
Yeah, that's true. And it's interesting because it's not something that Simondon himself puts a lot of emphasis on. It could just be, where we're coming from, with our own, background and what we're bringing to the text. But it's interesting that that has come up so much today. I guess it just shows that there's aspects of Simondon's work that you can draw out by starting from a different basis.
It feels more like it's just to link onto that idea of the relationship between logic and metaphysics. This feels like a moment where we're actually talking about a paradoxical event. Like it's prior to logic in the sense that it's paradox. Like I see where Deleuze talks about paradox and the logic of sense. This sounds like a technical description of kind of what he sort of stylizes it in terms of Alice in Wonderland. Like Alice in Wonderland is when she drinks the potion or whatever, she's getting bigger and smaller simultaneously. She's getting bigger than she was. I forget how it goes. It's like she's larger than she was, and smaller than she's becoming, or something like that. And it's a kind of way of expressing how events in the world receive sort of the criteria of directionality, and that's when they get this sort of second order specification of succession, or something that you're describing.
Yeah, there is a certain paradoxical element. I'm not sure if I would sort of line this up precisely with Deleuze on the event, which again is something that I would have to go back to Deleuze and look at that again to get the details right. But because I think in Deleuze it's the event itself that has this paradoxical structure, like you pointed to the Alice growing larger than she was and smaller, and she's becoming smaller than she will be. So she's becoming in both directions at the same time. So it's the event that has this paradoxical structure. Whereas for Simondon, it's the pre-individuated reality that has the paradoxical structure that's prior to logic, and then it's through that genetic process, it sort of becomes well behaved in logical terms. So I'm not sure if it lines up if the two sort of paradoxical moments line up precisely. But again, I'd have to go back to Deleuze to make sure I get that right.
The fact that you're drawing the distinction is helpful for me. So thanks.
Okay, so I think we can go on to the next. Oh, actually, maybe one thing to mention before we go on to the next one is this notion of phases as he's distinguishing it from the genus and species type of categorization. And he, I think right at the beginning of the book, he explicitly set out his opposition to the genus and species as a way of categorizing technical reality. And so now we see a more sort of principled reason why he's opposed to that form of categorization. Because in the introduction, he gave sort of an empirical reason, just saying that classification by genus and species will give you sort of bad categories. Like if I remember correctly, he points out that a mechanical clock and a crossbow have the same sort of fundamental principles. But if you classify objects by genus and species, then they'll end up in completely different categories, and then you miss the underlying mechanical properties that are shared by the two objects. So that's just sort of an empirical objection. But then now we get to a more fundamental objection to the method of categorization by genus and species, which is that the sort of ontologically fundamental process of differentiation is through this differentiation of phases rather than a genus that is subdivided into subspecies and so on. Okay, now I think we can go on to the next category, unless I think of something else. If someone else would like to read.
I can go again. So where are we at? We suppose that technicity? Is that right?
Yes, that's where we are.
We suppose that technicity results from a phase shift of a unique, central, and original mode of being in the world, the magical mode. The phase that balances our technicity is the religious mode of being. Aesthetic thought appears at the neutral point between technics and religion, at the moment of the splitting of the primitive magical unity. It is not a phase, but rather a permanent reminder of the rupture of unity of the magical mode of being, as well as a reminder of the search for its future unity. Each phase in turn splits into a theoretical mode and a practical mode. There is thus a practical mode of technics and a practical mode of religion, as well as a theoretical mode of technics and a theoretical mode of religion.
Right, and one aspect of his concept of the phase that we didn't sort of put emphasis on earlier is the notion of the central point, and so this is related to that structure of argument that I pointed to earlier that we've seen in a number of previous passages where he always takes some sort of opposition and then finds a underlying fundamental level from which those two opposed points of view on the subject are derived. And so this is the sort of ontological basis for that mode of argument, is that the phase is understood through this central point in relation to which the phases are dephased. So the phase difference is always in relation to the central point. And the central point is that from which the two phases or many phases are derived.
I'm trying to wrap my head around the nature of aesthetic thought for Simondon. I'm hoping that he goes into more detail with that later.
I believe he does. I'm not 100% sure though. But yeah, we'll see that as we go along. What I think he does give a little bit more explanation of how that fits in with technical reality and religious reality. And so I think we can go on to the next paragraph.
Okay. In the same way as the distance between technics and religion gives rise to aesthetic thought, the distance between the two theoretical modes, the technical one and the religious one, gives rise to scientific knowledge, as a mediation between technics and religion. The distance between the practical technical mode and the practical religious mode gives rise to ethical thinking. Aesthetic thought is thus a more primitive mediation between technics and religion than science and ethics, since the birth of science and of ethics requires a prior splitting between the theoretical and the practical mode at the heart of technics and of religion. Out of this arises the fact that aesthetic thought is indeed really situated at the neutral point, prolonging the existence of magic, whereas science on the one hand and ethics on the other oppose each other with respect to the neutral point, since there is the same distance between them as there is between the theoretical and practical mode in technics and religion. If science and ethics could converge and reunite, they would coincide within the axis of neutrality of this genetic system, thereby providing a second analog to the magical unity, above and beyond aesthetic thought, which is its first analog, and which is incomplete since it allows for the phase shift of technics and religion to subsist. This second analog would be complete. It would at once replace magic and aesthetics, but it is perhaps nothing more than a mere tendency playing a normative role, since nothing proves that the distance between the theoretical mode and the practical mode can be completely overcome. This direction defines philosophical research. So yeah, he seems to be giving a rather specific meta philosophical account in relation to magic and aesthetic thought, and philosophical thought being part 3 of 3 in these 3. Am I correct in that sorting or of these categories?
Yeah, I think that's right. There's so magic is the primitive or undifferentiated unity of being in the world, which then splits into technics and religion. And then each of those techniques and religion are split into theoretical and practical aspects, and then and they're also united through at the level of aesthetic thought. And then so the diagram doesn't present this quite as intuitively, but scientific thought and ethical thought they should be it should be rotated 90 degrees, I guess. It would be hard to fit that into the diagram, but they should be, each of them should be on one side of the central line, I guess you could say, of the unification. So scientific thought unites the practical aspect, or sorry, scientific thought unites the theoretical aspect of religion with the theoretical aspect of techniques, and then ethical thought unites the practical aspect of ethics of religion with the practical aspect of techniques. But each of those only has sort of half of the reality. Scientific thought has the technical half of or the theoretical half of reality, and ethical thought has the practical half of reality. And so they should be on either side of that central dividing line. And then philosophical thought is another mediation at a yet higher level.
Yeah, I can envision the diagram, if it were to be made into a 3D diagram, would be more easy to kind of see this this relation, because it doesn't seem that the theory or the practice would be either higher or lower in relation to the magic and the philosophical thought. So if you could kind of like get the scientific thought and ethical thought dimensions of the diagram and kind of imagine them along the z-axis, in other words, I think that is that more what you would have in mind?
Yeah, I think that would be how you'd have to represent it in 3 dimensions. So you take the whole plane, the whole sort of in the diagram as a square-ish shape, like the theology, inductive theory, applied ethics to normative ethics. You take that whole plane and rotate it 90 degrees so it's coming out from on that z-axis. But yeah, that's getting into some like elaborate data visualization type of process. But yeah, the diagram is still useful to sort of show the stages, but it doesn't show that relationship between scientific thought and ethical thought in relation to the aesthetic thought. It doesn't show that quite the way that he describes it in the text. Okay, so we can go on to the next paragraph and I can read. In order to indicate the true nature of technical objects, it is thus necessary to resort to a study of the entire genesis of the relations of man in the world. The technicity of objects will then appear as one of 2 phases of man's relation with the world, engendered by the splitting of the primitive magical unity. Must one then consider technicity as a simple moment of genesis? Yes, in a certain sense. There is indeed something transitory in technicity, which itself splits into theory and praxis and participates in the subsequent genesis of practical and theoretical thought. But in another sense, there is something definitive in the opposition of technicity to religiosity. For one can think that man's primitive way of being in the world, magic, can inexhaustibly furnish an indefinite number of successive contributions capable of splitting into a technical phase and a religious phase. In this way, even though there is effectively a succession in Genesis, the successive stages of different geneses are simultaneous within culture, and there exist relations and interactions not only between simultaneous phases, but also between successive stages. Not only can techniques encounter religion and aesthetic thought, but also science and ethics. Now, if one adopts the genetic postulate one notices that a science or an ethics can never encounter a religion or a techniques on a truly common ground, since the modes of thought are at different levels. For example, a science and a techniques, and exist at the same time. And they neither constitute a single genetic lineage nor arise from the same sudden outpouring of the primitive magical universe. True and balanced relations only exist between phases of the same level, for example, between a technical ensemble and a religion, or between successive degrees of genesis that are part of the same lineage, for example, between the stage of techniques and religions in the 17th century and the contemporary stages of science and ethics. True relations only exist in a genetic ensemble balanced around a neutral point, envisioned in its totality. So this is a further development of the thesis that he stated in the introduction to this part that we just read, namely that technical reality is a stage, or it has this provisional existence. So it's one stage of the process of genesis, and then it itself undergoes that genetic process and undergoes further differentiation. So he accepts that thesis, but he also qualifies it because he says, in another sense, there is something definitive in the opposition of technicity to religiosity. So that second sense, I think, is a little bit more difficult to draw out from the text. But as I understand it, the second sense in which technicity and religiosity have this definitive existence rather than provisional existence, I think it's the sense in which they can only be compared at the level of differentiation that they are at. So technical thinking can only properly be contrasted or compared with religious thinking, or properly balanced by religious thinking, whereas scientific thought can be compared with ethical thought. That's the sort of proper opposition or balance through the modes at the different stages of the genetic process. Whereas if you tried to compare, say, techniques and scientific thought, for example, those would be at different levels of the process of genetic differentiation, and so you wouldn't have that same balancing of the two aspects.
I also hear something else in the same passage. He seems to be saying to me that there is a residual existence of the relation between humankind and the magical universe, even in the modern world.
Yeah, I think that's right, in the sense that each of these processes of differentiation, it doesn't exhaust the reality that it's undergoing the differentiation. So magic is differentiated into techniques and religion, but that doesn't mean that magic is exhausted by that differentiation. There's still magical reality is still something that subsists even after that differentiation. And the same, of course, applies to all the subsequent differentiations. So, technical reality subsists even after the differentiation into theory and practice, and so on. And this might be a point to bring up another term that came up a little while ago that I forgot to sort of make note of at the bottom of 173. Just the last line where he describes the different phases as he said each separated reality is the symbol of the other, just as each phase is the symbol of the other phase or phases. So he's using the term symbol here, as he often does in other works. He's using it in the classical Greek sense that you find in Homer, for example. So a symbol in this sense was a sort of token that, like you take a pebble or something like that and break it in half, and then the two pieces fit together afterwards. And this was used for hospitality relationships. So if you were the guest of someone else, then you would create this symbol, these two pieces, and then that relationship would be passed down to the descendants of the people that had that relationship. And then they would use that symbol to, like the two pieces of the pebble that fit together, would be used to recognize the existence of that relationship in future generations. So that's what he means by symbol in that context. And then, so if we go back to where we were on page 175, so each of these, what he described as these properly balanced relationships. So the relationship between technical thought and religion, for example, that are both at the same level of differentiation in the genetic process, that would be a symbolic relation in that sense. The two pieces fit together.
Oh, I had never really heard of that notion of symbol. You said it was from Homeric philosophy?
Well, I mean, it's not, I guess, clear whether you would want to describe Homer as a philosophical writer, but it's used in the Homeric text in the Iliad and the Odyssey. This idea of a token that is passed on from one generation to the other that can be fit together with the other portion of the token, and that represents the relationship of hospitality.
Wow, yeah, that's incredibly fascinating. I think there are people who use the term Homeric philosophy, although knowing that Homer was a poet and not philosopher in a more substantial sense.
Right. I mean, there are philosophical concepts about the relationship of human, or the human mode of being in the world, or something like that, that you can draw out of non-philosophical texts, and Homer's works in particular, the way that they present they have a very distinct presentation of a certain mode of being of human beings, and a reality, the human reality that we can draw out of those works. So yeah, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong in talking about Homeric philosophy. So we're almost out of time. Let me just see how much we have left in the chapter.
Oh, it's almost done. Or this section.
Yeah, the section, sorry, yes. So maybe we can try to finish the section in the next 9-10 minutes or so.
Would you like me to read this, or would someone else like to?
Yeah, you can go ahead. It doesn't seem like anyone else is dying to read.
Okay, sure. This is precisely the wait. Yeah, that's where we are, right? This is precisely.
Yeah, that's right.
This is precisely the goal to be attained. The mission of reflexive thought is to lift upright and perfect the successive waves of Genesis through which the primitive unity of man's relation with the world splits in two and comes to sustain both science and ethics through technics and religion, between which aesthetic thought develops. In these successive splits, the primitive unity would be lost if science and ethics could not come back together at the end of Genesis. Philosophical thinking inserts itself between theoretical thought and practical thought by way of an extension of both aesthetic thought and the original magical unity. Now, in order for the unity of scientific knowledge and ethics to be possible in philosophical thought, the sources of science and ethics must be at the same level, complementary to each other, and have arrived at the same point of genetic development. The genesis of technics and of religion conditions that of science and of ethics. Philosophy is itself its own condition, for as soon as reflexive thinking has begun, it has the power to perfect whichever of the genuses that has not fully accomplished itself by becoming aware of the sense of the genetic process itself. Hence, in order to be able to pose the philosophical problem of the relations between knowledge and ethics in a profound way, one would first have to complete the genesis of technics and the genesis of religious thought, or at the very least for this task would be infinite, to know the real direction, sense of these two genuses. Here it seems that the mission of reflexive thought is on par with his meta philosophical claims about the position of philosophical thought. When he says philosophy is itself its own condition, and this kind of metaphilosophical distinction, I think, is fairly ordinary. To think of philosophy as a kind of epistemic state in which is necessarily reflexive, and or kind of turning back on itself.
Yeah, I think here he's using the term reflexive in the sense that it's this process of genesis, or this genetic process itself becomes the object of the genetic process in thought. So philosophy is one of the stages of the genetic process, but it also reconstitutes the whole genetic process in thought, which is what he's doing here in this book. Is setting up those stages. And by doing that, it can sort of set out the directions in which that thought is, or sorry, in which the genetic process is developing. And just a minor translation note again. So they put in brackets the word sens because it has multiple meanings in French. So it has the meaning of meaning, like the sens d'un mot, the meaning of a word. But then also sens can mean direction, like the direction of travel, or the direction of a road, or something like that. So both those meanings, like, I think they're both at work in this passage. So there's the meaning of a genetic process, and there's also the direction in which that genetic process is being carried out.
So with this, that second notion of sense, would you say that that's similar to the way that we use orientation or direction in English?
Yeah, direction is a perfectly adequate translation. Orientation maybe a little bit less, in the sense that orientation has a sort of navigational connotation to it. But yeah, I think direction works fine.
Okay, that's very helpful. Sense is oftentimes a word which I find widely diverges in meaning. It reminds me of the sense and reference distinction in Frege specifically, and the interpretational problems in approaching that subject.
Yeah, it's often, I mean, this is a sort of a key philosophical term in a lot of authors, and so it's always important to translate it accurately, but also difficult to get all the correct nuances when you're passing from one language to another. Oh, and yeah, so Burke has posted a video from YouTube on the Simondon, the token that you split in half and then use to recognize the counterpart. So yeah, we can check that out after we finish here in a couple minutes. So I don't know if anyone has any last comments before we finish. Okay, so in that case, I guess we can stop here, and we can pick up at section 2 next time. Yeah, and so yeah, same time I think works for me, and hopefully it works for everyone else.
Yeah, hoping so. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I hope so.
All right, well, thank you everyone for joining in today, and I'll see you all next week then.
Bye for now. Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, and bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.